Now, last year, the South African Reserve Bank highlighted a World Bank estimate showing that 12 million adults in South Africa remain unbanked, basically aren't using a bank, do not have an account. This comes as debate grows over the creation of a state-owned bank, whether that would curb that situation. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the postbank, which mainly serves rural and poor communities, is still not ready for a full banking license, as it must first meet key compliance requirements. But does South Africa really need a state bank in order to improve financial inclusion? Let's unpack this. Independent economist Duma Gqubule joining us now for this conversation. Duma, always good chatting to you. I guess that's the first question. Do we actually need a state bank?
You know, Arabi, we definitely do need a state bank, and I've been talking about it for a long time. We already have state ownership in African Bank. We could build upon that, and some elements of Postbank, could be incorporated into the state bank. But this bank would not be a large bank, to make. So now, in all the development, the highly successful Asian developmental states, state control and influence over finance was the defining feature of the developmental states in Asia. Now, if you read the history of countries like South Korea, the banks were nationalized and they were aligned with the National Development Plan. And there was high-risk lending, and they powered the growth of Asia for many decades. And in Asia, in China, what we saw is that the banks were initially all state-owned. They all collapsed. I think there was a big collapse around the turn of the century, and the Chinese development model was at stake. So they restructured their state banks. There was a huge capital injection by the state, about 500 billion rand bailout of the state banks, and they were partially privatized and listed some of them on the stock exchange. And they provide, so these state banks and state control of finance provides another element of macroeconomic policy. So, for example, after the global financial crisis in China, the stimulus from the state banks was bigger than the stimulus from the fiscus,
Yeah.
So we need to also do that in South Africa. And the way I see it, when Arabile, is that, let's say we create it in African Bank. The management of African Bank wants to list this bank. I don't think that's a good idea. This thing must serve a developmental purpose and not be there to enrich, the black shareholders that might join and the management of African Bank. It should be towards driving the development of a country. I think we could have developmental windows for taxis initially and for housing.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that there has to be 100% formalization of the taxi industry. In a previous life, I used to work for an advisor for the Department of Transport, and they currently borrow up to 27%, pay up to 27% interest at transaction capital. So I think that the state should take over a developmental window from the Reserve Bank, low-cost financing for taxis. So, for example, you could provide a window for the taxis from the Reserve Bank, let's say 3%, 4%, and the state bank takes a margin on that, and they can get low-cost financing, in addition to a subsidy from the government, which they should get,
Important ideas, and I think the theory sounds absolutely great. Even some of the countries you've mentioned. The rule of law becomes a key proponent to this, because accountability when things go wrong are very prudent and very high on the agenda in areas like South Korea and China, both of which have had their own issues, one has to admit as well. And if this bank that we then put together is just a retail bank, when I say retail, it just occupies the day-to-day services of putting your salary in, you spend it on a day-to-day basis, you and I, and not investments and major money brought in like that, would it not actually take away from being able to grow and add to South Africa's budget and the fiscus as you added?
Yes. Okay. So what it should do? Okay. So on the deposit side, obviously it must increase access to services to the people, the 12 million people that you're unbanked, through innovative ways to address the unbanked, as you said in your clip. But on the lending side, I'm saying that we should start, I think it should focus on public transport, number one, through taxis. Number two, I do think that the government should take over the financing of houses below $1 million, the so-called missing middle, above a RDP house and up to maybe R1 million. And they could provide low-cost financing housing. You could see in China, until they went to excesses, provision of housing was a big part of their growth plan until they went to excesses in terms of housing. So I do think that, and they could also do other issues like lending for small business. There's a massive failure in terms of small business financing in South Africa that I feel very strongly about. The traditional banks, they lend about 40 billion rands to their balance sheet exposure to black SMMEs is about 40 billion rands, which is about 0.5% of total assets of the banks. And that, for me, is evidence of racial profiling or racism by the banks which refuse to lend to black SMMEs. So we need to have a whole system to provide financing to black SMMEs to get this economy growing. And that could include a state bank and also more aggressive developmental targets for banks and more aggressive lending by the other development finance institutions like the National Empowerment Fund and the IDC. So I think we should get the whole system working towards black SMME finance. Yeah. And this state bank must also provide some of the things that we need to grow the economy. Arabile, if the government loves the people of South Africa, we should not have people, going to work in these taxis. It's absolutely a shame. So yeah. I think we should reimagine this taxi industry, and we should replace the entire fleet with new energy vehicles, with local manufacturing and joint venture with the Chinese, and create many jobs for South Africans. We should reimagine this taxi industry with 100% formalization.
Okay, then Duma, what's happened to DBSA, Development Bank of South Africa? What's happened to the National Housing Finance Corporation, which is supposed to help in this regard too? Are we not just creating, and this might be the word of some detractors, those who are not in agreement with creating a state bank, saying that all we'd be doing is creating another institution that could be plundered and have corruption and captured?
No, I understand that. And as you said, transparency is critical. We must deploy the best people, the best brains in South Africa. And, too often we deploy the worst people into these institutions. Yeah. But they must serve a developmental angle. So the Development Bank of South Africa lends, last time I looked, mostly to municipalities for infrastructure and that. And they've got a specific mandate. And also which one are we talking about? The other one,
the National Housing Finance Corporation.
Yeah, I was actually supposed to meet them, and I haven't actually met them because So the National Housing Finance Corporation addresses some of what I'm saying the state bank must do, and perhaps they could be merged together with the state bank to provide the housing that I think should be provided, mass housing for South Africans, cheaper financing than you find at the banks. And we could rationalize the current, what's happening in the state sector. Yeah.
Do you think we could fix the postbank? Because it seems like the main contract it relies on is that of the Social Security Agency.
Well, I think you should follow up at Newzroom, because I understand that the management of the postbank is not happy with what the minister decided to be able to stop the link between Postbank and the bank, because it requires government business to be viable. So it doesn't make any sense for them to break that relationship. And we should be supporting the the Postbank with more, government deposits, SASSA payments, and things and more, to make it more viable than it is now.
Look, Duma, we actually have a poll running with regards to this very question today on the screen. So we're going to try and share that with you as well in the meantime, because we asked the audience, those who are watching today, do you think South Africa needs a state-owned bank? And we asked them, we gave them three options. Yes, for public interest. The second option was no, for private banks only. The third option was only with strict control. 64% certainly are saying that for public interest, we do need one. That's 64% of the vote going there. Nearly 20%, 19% are saying no, private banks only, and 17% saying only with strict control. One must say that the strict control portion is very important because at the start, how do you capitalize that business? Because you would need to then have, I would assume, ATMs plus the technological infrastructure everywhere across the country, or do you piggyback off of your current private lenders, and that means you need to get into conjunction with them?
Yes, and so I think for black South Africans, our private banks do not serve our interests. You know, as I've given you figures about black SME finance, and I could give you more. So that's the first thing, is that, so we need, and we also need diversity of ownership in the banking sector. You know, countries like Germany, they've got community banks, they've got cooperative banks. Why don't we have a bank for Soweto, for Tembisa, that can, you know, we have to have diversity of ownership of the banks. We can't have a big five that has 90% of the 90% of the deposits.
Duma, yeah. We had VBS, we had Itala, and both have unfortunately landed in the situation they're in.
Yeah, that is inexcusable completely. It's inexcusable, and you know the law must deal with what happened at VBS. But the point is, because Steinhoff collapsed, it doesn't mean that the capitalist system must end. You know, so I just do think that we have to have more. The financial sector must serve the development needs of the country. And as the poll is saying, there must be strict monitoring of what happens in the financial sector. We already have the Reserve Bank. They monitor the banks quite thoroughly, and you know they must continue to do that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had more thoughts on the Reserve Bank. We always know that that's a touchy subject to talk on with yourself. Duma, appreciate your time though. Really, really great chatting to you. We'll chat again soon. Duma Gqubule, independent economist there, as we talk about South Africa's possible need for a state bank. President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking about a possible merger between the Postbank and even African Bank. There are shares that we have in both. There's even DBSA, etc. We'll get to see how things happen here over time.